Welcome to the New Orleans History Podcast. I'm your host, Rob. We're now on episode 2, which is about the Louisiana Purchase. That was a big epic event in New Orleans history because New Orleans had belonged to the French and then the Spanish, and then the Louisiana Purchase, where Napoleon sold Louisiana to Jefferson. New Orleans became the most important port in the United States because it was situated at the bottom of the Mississippi River. And in those days, there weren't interstate highways. Everything was traveled by water. So goods would come down to New Orleans and then be shipped abroad. Goods would come into New Orleans and be shipped up the river. There was a huge river trade, and you've heard of river boats, steamboats, all this stuff. So the Louisiana Purchase occurred because the Spanish monarchy was in chaos. They were fighting out over who should be king, and they were all incompetent and idiots. So they decided to invite Napoleon Bonaparte, who was the emperor of France at the time, invite him to send a king to be the king of Spain. So he sent his brother Joseph there. Joseph didn't like it. He had been the king of Naples, which is based in Naples and a kingdom of the two Sicilies. And he had a good time down there, but he agreed, or New Orleans, or Napoleon more or less forced him to come and be king of Spain. And he had a rough time because they had started guerrilla warfare against him. If you've never heard of guerrilla warfare, that's a Spanish term. And it means these people that, hit and run. So they would attack the French forces and kill a bunch of people and then take off. They wouldn't even confront them. But when they were captured, they were executed. They were killed by a firing squad. And there's famous paintings by Goya that show them being executed, the Spanish patriots, by the French army. The French army ended up having to fight for the Spanish peninsula, which is called Iberia, and they suffered terrible defeats from the Duke of Wellington. But that's later on. So the Louisiana Purchase cost $14 million and included New Orleans and included this big piece of the United States. And if you take history in Louisiana, they'll show you a big map where there's this wedge that's maybe 2/5 maybe of what the United States is, a big wedge that includes, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky. And once we owned Louisiana, the President Jefferson sent a couple of guys that he trusted to scout it out, and that was called the Lewis and Clark Expedition. I think it was Major Clark and Captain Lewis. And they had with them, they had a woman called Sacagawea, who was about 22 years old, and she was married to a Frenchman. And she basically saved their bacon because she could speak several languages, and she negotiated with the Indians. So the Lewis and Clark expedition was on the brink of starvation a lot of times because they found out that the goods that they brought to trade with the Indians were worthless to the Indians. So they ended up just living on charity and having the Indians bring them a horse to eat or a couple of deer, just because the Indians felt sorry for them. Anyway, back to New Orleans. So New Orleans became the most important port and the richest port in the United States. And immediately, people from up north came down to try to make their fortune on the river trade. When they got to Louisiana, they tried to buy property in the French Quarter to live and set up their shops and businesses, but they found to their horror that the people that lived there, who were French and Spanish and had their own culture, they had a French opera house, for example, which unfortunately burned down later. Anyway, they didn't want no part of these Americans, these Anglos, so they wouldn't sell them any land or any businesses. They wouldn't sell their houses. So they decided to establish their own neighborhood where each house would be on like a city block be right in the middle of the block, and then they'd have gardens all around it. And that was the original garden district. Of course, that couldn't persist because if there was just one house per block, the garden district would have a very small population. So they ended up filling it in and putting houses along the streets. And if you go there to the garden district, there'd be a house and it has a fence on the street, and you peer through the fence and take pictures. And you can get guidebooks to the garden district, and you can go around and take pictures and be a tourist. They also have tours of the homes where you can go inside. You can have guides that meet you at this bookstore called the Garden District Bookstore, and they'll take you around and show you stuff. Anyway, the Louisiana Purchase, there's a myth that it occurred in the Cabildo, which is a building downtown on Jackson Square. But in fact, the documents were signed in Paris. And as I said, it was $14 million for this huge amount of land that nobody knew what was there. And that's why Lewis and Clark had to explore it. But people did know about New Orleans. It was already a busy port. And as I said before, it became the most important and the richest port in the United States. Everything was done by river traffic, and it went down there. So that's a significant date in Louisiana history, the Louisiana Purchase. And it changed everything. New Orleans became part of America. And then this went on until the Civil War. New Orleans was one of the first places occupied by Union troops. So in a future episode, we're also going to talk about the slave market for 3 episodes. So slaves were sold in New Orleans, and there was a big market. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap that up for episode 2. And we'll just have a short one.